So, David, this is what, your fourth book? Fifth?
5 or 6.
Fifth or sixth book? Well, congratulations on this book. The person who's applauding has probably already cracked the binding on it. I saw a woman back there who was reading it as we came in, and it is superb. But I don't want to start on page 1. I want to start on page 106 to give you sort of the runway to give your initial thoughts. You write, "The breakdown in basic moral skills produced disconnection, alienation, and a culture in which cruelty was permitted. Our failure to the failure to treat each other well in the small encounters of everyday life metastasized, and I believe, led to the horrific social breakdown we see all around us. This is a massive civilizational failure. We need to rediscover ways to teach moral and social skills. This crisis helped motivate me to write this book." So talk more about why that crisis motivated you to not only write how to know a person, but to actually give us the skills to know a person.
First, thank you, Jonathan. I'm very grateful to you for coming out here from DC and joining me in this. It's a pleasure to do this with you. It's a pleasure to introduce you to my alma mater. I mentioned to Jonathan backstage, some of you probably all know this, I hope it's not apocryphal. When Obama got elected, this school was a normal school when I lived here. Now I can't believe what I'm looking at. And when Obamas were elected, the front page headline I was told at the Hyde Park Herald was, "2 slots open at lab school." So people in this neighborhood knows what really matters. And it's a pleasure for me to be back here. When I was 17, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should come to Chicago. It turned out to be the perfect place for me. I fit right in. I had a double major here in history and celibacy during my 4 years here. And I actually became a boxing manager here. Freshman year, my freshman roommate entered the Golden Gloves boxing competition. And he had never boxed a second in his life. And so we gave him a nickname, the Kosher Killer. And then we trained the Chicago way. We didn't practice boxing. We read a lot of books about boxing. And he lasted 29 seconds in his 1-0.
Oh.
But we made the front page of the Chicago Tribune. And so finally I have to give you my favorite saying about the University of Chicago, which is, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so we have come to an intellectual mecca. Not always a social mecca, though. And so, the passage you read, it gets funnier, by the way, the book. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny before page 106, yeah, but it does get funny even more funny.
The thing of the stuff we talk about on Fridays, I think a lot of it has primordial roots in a basic failure of our social fabric. And so all sorts of weird stuff is happening. So we know about the rise in depression, the rise of suicide. Only 54% of Americans say that knows them well. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends has gone up 4 times since 2000. 45% of teenagers rate themselves persistently hopeless and despondent. The share of Americans who give themselves the lowest happiness category has gone up by 50% since 2000. So we talk about the surface thing, which is the anger and the polarization and the bitterness in our politics. But I think it flows from loneliness, disconnection in our regular old lives. And when you tell people that there's nothing crueler than to not see someone, to render them invisible, they don't matter. And another thing that influenced this book was the first page of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And in that book, if you remember the first page, the very first page, he says, when people look at me, they see everything but me. They see their stereotypes of me. They see the environment around me. They see their projections, but they don't see me. And I want to prove I'm part of life, so I want to lash out at them, which is the normal reaction if nobody sees you. You see it as an injustice because it is an injustice. and you want to lash out. And so that leads to the meanness in our society, and eventually to the meanness in our politics. And so to me, this book is in part, it's not only for the lonely people, but it's in part to help people repair what is the relational vacuum in society. And it means to be a very practical book, as you say, where I start out the first minute you meet someone, how do you greet them? Then if you're just hanging around someone, how do you hang around with them? Then if you're going to have a conversation, how do you get really good at conversation? And they're going to have conversation across difference of inequality of income or of ideology or of race or ethnicity. How do you do that? And so it's just meant to be a practical walk through those processes so we can get better and do the things we need to repair the rot at the foundation of our society. And the final thing I'll say is you can't have a healthy democracy on top of a rotting society. And so this is meant to be a bit of a way to rebut that, a little brick thrown in the right side of history.
The subtitle is, the title of the book is How to Know a Person. You spend the first part of the book basically reteaching us how to see each other. And then later on you say, really this book is about how we hear each other, but also how we're able to be heard. So start with the seeing part, because you go right back to the beginning. How do people see each other?
Yeah, so when you meet somebody, you're unconsciously asking yourself a question. Does this person prioritize me? Am I a person to this person, or am I just a thing to them? And the answers to those questions will be communicated in the eyes before there's any word is said. And so I'll give you an example. There's a woman I was having breakfast with in Waco, Texas, named LaRue Dorsey. And she's a 93-year-old lady who was a teacher most of her career. And I'm having breakfast with her, and she presents herself to me as a stern disciplinarian, drill sergeant type. She said, I love my students enough to discipline them. And I was a little intimidated by her. And to the diner comes a mutual friend of ours named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy's a pastor. He pastors to the homeless in Waco. And he comes up to our table, sees us, and he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders and shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you. And that stern drill sergeant lady I'd been talking to turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. And attention is a moral act. It calls forth things into being. And if you look at people that way, then if you shine that kind of attention on me, I will blossom. If you see potential in me, I will see potential in myself. And so part of it is Jimmy is a more ebullient person than I am. But part of it, and I think the profounder part, is that Jimmy is, as I say, he's a pastor. And so when he sees anybody, any human being he meets, he sees someone made in the image of God. He sees someone with a soul of infinite value and dignity. He sees someone so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you could be an atheist, an agnostic, a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, whatever. Seeing each person you meet with that level of respect and reverence is the precondition for seeing them well. Understanding that each person is not a problem to be solved. Each person is a mystery you'll never get to the bottom of. And so you approach them with respect and reverence, and then just awesome curiosity, because everybody is stranger than you think. And I met a woman, this was years ago, she was a big Trump supporter, and she was a lesbian biker who converted to Sufi Islam after surviving a plane crash. I was like, wow, what stereotype do you fit into?
I'm sorry, you lost me at lesbian Trump supporter, but I mean, we can just move on. So you talked about how we see people. Showering someone with recognition, looking them in the eyes. But you have a whole chapter on how not to see a person. Talk about how, and we all do this, how we go about not seeing someone.
Yeah, well, the number one reason we don't see each other is egotism. We're into ourselves. And I found I'll leave a party, I don't know if it's for you, if this resonates with your experience, but I'll leave a party and I'll think, that whole time nobody asked me a question. And I think only about 30% of people are question askers. The other 70% are nice, they just don't ask questions. And where we live, it's especially bad. I'm not going to reveal the name, it's not in the book, but I was on the phone with somebody at the White House, the kind of person we talk to. And
Current White House?
Current and Obama.
Okay.
It doesn't really narrow it down. And so he's talking to me on some issue, and our call drops. And
That's in the book. You didn't name the name, but that story's in the book.
Oh, is it in the book?
Yeah, it is in the book.
Okay, I forgot I put it in the book.
But go on, because it's a good one.
So I don't, I figured he'll call back in 3 minutes. So 3 minutes go by, 4 minutes go by, 5 minutes go by, 7 minutes go by. And he doesn't call me back. And finally I call his office and I talk to his assistant and she says, well, he can't talk now, he's on the phone. And I'm like, no, he's on the phone with me. He's on the phone with me. And so people just blather. That's one reason. The second is a lot of people, people love the sound of their own voice. Look at me right now. But another reason is what they call naive realism. That's the belief that the way the world looks to you is the way it looks to everybody. And so there's a little story, a two-sentence story, that it's about a guy on one side of the river, and there's a woman on the other side of the river, and she screams at him. And she says, how do I get to the other side of the river? And he screams to her, you are on the other side of the river. Like, and so he can't get into her vantage point. And then the final thing I'll mention, I have a little passage in there, a great classic memoir named Fierce Attachments by Vivian Gornick. And the book, the beautiful book, and it's her relationship with her mom. And they spent their whole lives really in a loving battle to see who's to blame for all the hurt they've given each other. And it's a beautiful description of you can love someone and not know them because they don't actually know each other. And even though they're around each other and they can't get away from each other. But at one point in a very moving scene, Vivian Gornick says, it kills me, my mother not knowing I'm there. Because they only know the effect they have on each other, they don't know who the other person is. And so even in intimacy with knowledge, it's possible not to really see the person who is your own child or your own mom.
There's one more here, and I underlined the hell out of it, essentialism. Talk about essentialism, because I run into this a lot.
Yeah, I imagine. Essentialism is deciding the social categories we have in our head actually go down to some biological essence, and therefore everybody in that category is the same. Or you can do the stacking. If I know one thing about a person, then I can make a whole series of assumptions about that person. That's called stacking. And so, tell me why essentialism resonated.
It's this part here. Essentialists imagine that people in one group are more alike than they really are. They imagine that people in other groups are more different from us than they really are. If this person supported Donald Trump, then this person must also be like this, and this. Guilty. I totally own it. I totally own it. But why I own and I want to deal with this, Doctor, later on in the conversation. And I'm serious about that because later on in the book you get into hard conversations. But please hold on that. On the story he told about the administration official who just kept talking and didn't realize the call had dropped. That's on page 74. And you write, maybe I bring this out in people, but I often find myself on the receiving end of what the journalist Calvin Trillin calls bore bombs. People who think conversation is them giving you a lecture. Lord have mercy, you've described Washington in a sense. How do you deal with bore bombs? Because you had to deal with that person over the phone. But how many times have you been cornered in Washington at a cocktail party or a conference where you're just dying a slow death because the person is they won't stop talking?
I once critiqued somebody in a column and he said, let me take you out to breakfast so I can persuade you that you're wrong. So I went out to breakfast with him and he talked at me for about an hour and a half, like the omelet came. And I'm just watching his omelet get colder and colder. And so, one of the things I have in the book is tips to how to be a better conversationalist, because one of the truths about life is we all think we're good conversationalists. but we're not as good as we think we are. And so some of these tips are, one of them is be a loud listener. Like when I have a buddy who lives in Philly, and when you talk to him, it's like you're talking to a Pentecostal church. He's like, yes, amen, amen, preach that. And I just love talking to that guy. He's just good at drawing you out. And then other is, for example, if we're having a conversation and my comment starts at my shoulder and goes to my fingertips, at what point have you stopped listening so you can think of what to say? It's probably here. And so let me talk to my fingertips, and then pause, and then respond. And then the final tip I'll give right now is don't be a topper. That if somebody says I'm having problems with my teenage boy, I'm going to say, oh, I know exactly what you're going through. I'm having problems with my teenage boy. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate, but really what I'm doing is shifting the conversation from you back to me. And so it's called topping. So those are some tips. But I have not, those people who bore us, I do not have a remedy for that. And my only remedy when somebody does that to me is like, well, we will not be enjoying you will not be enjoying my company anymore, because that will never happen.
On your point about don't be a topper, you quote Monica Guzman, who wrote a book, I Never Thought of It That Way. She said, the lesson she has drawn from her experience is the same lesson I have drawn. And you quote her, the experience of being listened to all the way on something until your meaning is completely clear to another human being is extremely rare in life. Why is there this need for seemingly everybody to not let someone finish the thought?
Let me interrupt you there.
Yeah. But talk more about it, because that's another thing that drives me bananas.
Yeah, well, we're into presentation mode. And then I think there's also a thing where we're uncomfortable when somebody starts telling their story. And so we get, like, I have a section in the book about the quality of your conversation will be the quality of your questions. And kids are just phenomenal at question asking. And I mentioned in there, there's a woman I'm friends with named Naomi Way, who's in New York. She teaches 7th grade boys how to be interviewers, how to be journalists. And so for the first time she ever taught this, she sat in the front of the class and she said, okay, ask me anything, I'll give you an honest answer. So one of the 7th grade boys said, are you married? And she said, no. Second boy said, are you divorced? She said, yes. Third boy said, do you still love him? She was like, whoa. And so, and she said, yes. And then they said, does he know? Do your kids know? And by now she's crying. And so kids will go there. But as adults, we're a little shy about it. We don't appear stupid. And then, there's a guy up at Northwestern named Dan McAdams who studies how people tell their life stories. And he has people come in to his office and he asks them their life story. He says, tell me your high points, tell me your low points, tell me your turning points. And the sessions last up to 4 hours. Half the people cry while recounting some part of their life. And then at the end, he gives them some money to compensate for them for their time. And a bunch of the people push the money back and say, I'm not taking money for this. This has been one of the best afternoons of my life, because no one has ever asked me. And since we're in Chicago, I should mention the quote I have in there from Studs Terkel, which he said, listen, 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 they will always talk. Oh, if you listen respectfully, they will talk. And you'll find something fascinating about most people.
But isn't it also, you also write the fact that one of the reasons why people push the money away is not only because someone asked them the question, it's that someone took the time to listen. And that a lot of what ails us is that there's so many people who feel not just unseen, but not listened to. Talk more about that.
Yeah, no, I as I mentioned, I think you referred to this, it's called the art of seeing others, yep. But it's really conversation. It's the art of having a kind of conversation that is memorable. And so, again, that's a question of questions. I was out with a political scientist, and he was 80, and he was saying, I'm probably got one more project left in me. What should it be? And that led to like an hour and a half conversation of what were his interests, what was his contribution, what's it like to be 80, What's it like to confront death? And we went on. It was a great conversation because he laid a big question on the table. And so other examples for me of big questions are the kind of questions that lift people above their normal vantage point so they can see themselves from a distance. And you have to know somebody well before you ask these. You don't want to do it on first meeting. But it's like, if this 5 years is a chapter in your life, what's the chapter about? Or what would you do if you weren't afraid? I have a buddy who was in a job interview, and he turned around at the end and asked the interviewer, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying, because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company if she wasn't afraid. And so fear plays a role in a lot of our lives. I have a question that I ask my wife, finds it incredibly pretentious, but it works every time when you're with a group of people, which is, how do your ancestors show up in your life? So we all are affected by the heritages we come from. And I asked this question at a dinner party, and we had a Dutch couple, and we had a black couple, and I forget who else, and then I talked about my Jewish ancestry. And we all went around the table, and we talked about different heritages, and we speculated about how we've been influenced, how we see the world because of these centuries-long experiences our families have had. It was fantastic. And so big questions, bigger questions than normal, than, how are the Bears doing?
Well, I want you to tell everyone the story that you write about in terms of this, asking questions from the 35,000-foot view, someone who kind of knows you well, who can tell you about you that you can't see about yourself. And you tell the story about David Bradley, who hundreds of people, now I kind of want to go to David Bradley and ask him to do this for me, but you went to him and you were at a crisis point in your life, and tell this story.
Yeah, so there's a guy, David Bradley, who's a friend of ours, who started a couple companies, and then he bought the Atlantic magazine. He recently sold it. And so when you're in a moment of indecision, say should I marry this person, or should I divorce this person, or should I take this job? Or in my case, it was, I'm overwhelmed with life right now. I'm just overwhelmed, and I'm using time poorly. And so you go to him, and he asks you a whole bunch of questions, and then after about half an hour, he hands you a newspaper, and he says, read this for 10 or 15 minutes. And when he's done, he slides a bunch of index cards across you, and he hasn't told you what to think or what to do. He's giving you an analytic frame you can walk through in order to think about this problem. And to me, the wise people in the world now are not the people like Yoda or Dumbledore who give us these maxims that tell us what to do. They're the people who provide a hospitable experience in which we can think. And so I mentioned this at a party we were at, and this index card trick that David does, and I saw half the faces nodding because he'd done it for all these people. And people, 20 years later, they have his index card taped to their mirror because he's clarified, here's how I think about my problem. And David's skill in starting two companies and then transforming the Atlantic is hiring. And so he looks for two things in people. One is extreme talent. So if you say, I love teaching, he doesn't want to hear that. That's not detailed enough. Do you like lesson plans? Do you like working with special needs? What little thing, part of teaching, do you like the most? And he wants to get the narrowest definition of your talent as possible so he can surround you with the right people. And then the second thing he looks for is what he calls spirit of generosity. Is this person going to be generous to colleagues? And he does that by a method he calls take me back. And so he says, take me back to your childhood. Because in a job interview, people want to talk about their career, they don't want to talk about their childhood. But he'll say, take me back to your childhood. And his theory is that whoever you were in high school, you're still carrying all those insecurities around inside you. And so he wants to get them telling about some experience they had in high school. And he's getting people into narrative mode, and this is crucial, that it's easy to get people to give you statements. But you want to get them telling stories. And so when I'm interviewing voters now, I don't ask, what do you believe? I ask, how did you come to believe that? And then they're telling me a story about an important person in their life who shaped their values or an experience they had. Want to get them into narrative mode. One other quick story about narrative mode. I read this in a book called You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy. And she describes a focus group moderator who was hired by grocery stores to figure out why people come to the grocery store late at night. And she could have just said to the grocery store, the focus group, why do you go to the grocery store late at night? Instead, she asked a story question, which is, tell me about the last time you went to a grocery store after 11 p.m. And one of the women who hadn't said anything in the focus group yet said, well, I'd smoked a joint and I needed a menage a trois with me, Ben and Jerry. And that, and so you get a little glimpse into her life, like you and Hannah. Stories we can't tell on the news hour.
Right. Although, I mean, it'd be great if we did tell these stories on the news hour. Okay, I'm not sure where we are in terms of time before we go to Q&A, but I want to make sure, David, we have the hard conversation, because I'm going to need some help on that other thing I said before. So I'm going to read some paragraphs from the hard conversations chapter, and then we can get into my couch session. So you write, for members of dominant or majority groups, there's usually little or no gap between how others see you and how you see yourself. For people from marginalized or historically oppressed groups, there's usually a chasm between who you are and how you are perceived. You write, slapping a label on someone is a great way to render them invisible and destroy a hard conversation. Hard conversations are hard because people in different life circumstances construct very different realities. It's not only that they have different opinions about the same world, they literally see different worlds. And I think there was one more. Nope, that was it. So when it comes to, I read all of those because as I read those, I kept coming back, not just to my encounters with various people when talking about race or LGBTQ issues. I also thought about how I go about thinking about, generally speaking, Trump supporters, and how I have a problem with someone who says he was a terrific president and I would vote for him again, knowing full well what he did in those 4 years as president. And so and as a journalist, I sometimes have to have these conversations, and I try really hard not to dismiss them. But I'm sure there are folks in the audience here who are like, how is it possible for me to have a hard conversation with, forget about a stranger, Uncle Bob at Thanksgiving dinner? How can I have a hard conversation with someone who, I heard that, don't was the advice. But, and I'm with you. I'm just waiting to hear what David has to say. How am I going to have a hard conversation with someone who, through their support of Trump, in a way to me feels like they are denying my humanity?
So that's why they're hard. And so I guess I'd say, so, you know, when in 2015, I wrote 600 columns with the theme, don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination. And so at the time, I was living in DC, my social life was in New York, and I was teaching at Yale. So how could I be out of touch with America? You know? And so since then, I've had thousands of conversations. I have members of my family who voted for Trump. I have members of close friends from decades long who voted for Trump. And so I just want to know why. And so I'll give you one story. So I'm in South Dakota, and there's a 7-year-old guy I meet, and he said, let me tell you about the best day of my life. But I was 35. I was managing a section in a plant, and they replaced the equipment, and I was no longer qualified to be foreman of this section. And so I decided I'd just slip out of there and not make a fuss. So he gets he puts all his belongings in a box, opens his office door, and there are 3,600 people forming a double line from his office door in the plant to his car door in the parking lot. And he walks through this line, and they're applauding him the whole way. And he said, every job I've ever had since then has been worse. And my life has gone downhill for 35 years. And so he says, that guy Trump is a jackass, but I need a change. And so it may not explain everything. We both could raise like 9 million reasons why this is not a good idea. But I sort of see where he's coming from. And so just in general in hard conversations, I think there are a couple things that I've learned from this. First, the conversation takes place at two levels. There's what we're nominally talking about, and then there's the under conversation, which is the flow of emotions that are taking place as we talk. Everything I say, I'm either making you feel more safe or less safe. And so to be super conscious of those flow of emotions. The second thing, especially as someone who comes in with a lot of elite baggage, New York Times, Yale, University of Chicago, my job when somebody critiques me is to stand in their standpoint. It's to ask them 3 or 4 different ways, 3 or 4 different times, tell me more, what am I missing here? And I found that the 4th and 5th question is when you really get to the reality of what they believe. And I may not persuade them and I may not like them, but I'm showing them respect. The respect of being curious about their point of view. And there's a great book called Crucial Conversations that says, respect is like air. In any conversation, when it's present, nobody notices. When it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. And I found if I can lead with that kind of respect of curiosity, then we can have a good conversation across what could be very extreme differences. And every conversation takes place in a frame. And I've got to stay in his frame. I don't want to yank it over to my frame where I'm comfortable. And so there's a whole series of tips of how to deal with that kind of conversation. And it sometimes worked magic for me. Sometimes I failed. I was at a ball game with my wife, and there's a guy in the ninth inning. He turns around and sees me, and he says, "Are you David Brooks?" And usually I'm expecting, "Oh, I like your show," or I like your column. And he turns around to me and goes, "You're an effing a-hole."
We're among friends. Just say it, David. Say it.
And very polite here in Chicago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I think, I should do my thing, the hard conversation. But my son who's there, says, "Hey, cool it." And he says, "You should be ashamed of this man. He's evil. Look, my hands are shaking. I'm in the presence of Satan." And then my wife tries to intervene. He says, "Get off me, woman." So it deteriorates.
Yeah.
And so the noble self that I am is to be able to rise above and calmly respect him. No, that didn't happen. So they finally threw him out of the ballpark.
Oh, I was going to say, so what did happen, David? You start out the Hard Conversations chapter telling the story. You didn't name names, but it was a panel discussion.
Which you were at.
So it was that. I was wondering. Oh, man. But I thought it was an earlier year. Was that Aspen?
No, we were, I can't say, because I don't name the person I'm...
Okay,
but
later.
We were at an island off the coast of East Coast.
Got it. Oh, okay. Oh, this makes it so much more interesting. So I bring that up. Wow, my mind has been blown. You write, this was a hard conversation about
culture war.
That's right. Culture war was the triggering phrase, and it was you, New York Times, Ivy League educated.
Not Ivy League, better.
Sorry, University of Chicago. Because of Yale. That's why I thought that. All your bubbles, and here this person was, woman, African American. And so you both got into it respectfully, but you wrote this terrific end of this paragraph. Our encounters are shaped by our historical inheritances, the legacies of slavery, elitism, sexism, prejudice, bigotry, and economic and social domination. You can't get to know another person while pretending not to see ideology, class, race, faith, identity, or any of the other fraught social categories. And I love that because in that right there, David, I felt seen. Where I take issue, back to the Trump supporter and back on the couch, is that I feel like, because before you said, seeing where someone else is coming from when it comes to that person. And a lot of times I feel like that person isn't willing to do the same for me. And so there's always this demand that because I'm some elitist East Coast person, so on and so forth, that therefore I'm not a person. I'm not complex. You don't know me. And so I feel like sometimes everything you write about in this book is demanding a two-way street.
Yeah, that is true.
And a lot of times it feels like one way.
Yeah. And some of it, our job, we do a lot of one way. Like we're curious about other people. So I think it's even if there's no reciprocity, there's going to be a limit to how deep you can go with a person if they're not curious back. In order to be beheld, you have to be willing to behold. It has to be a reciprocal two-way street. And so, I often, to be honest, in a lot of my interviews with Trump supporters, I'm constantly asking questions, and I'm terrified they're going to say, "Where do you work?" And they never do. So, if I had to say New York Times, it would be complicated, but it would mar a little of the good spirit we're having together. But nonetheless, I do think what I was trying to get at with that phrase is like to see you and to make you feel seen. I've got to see you for the unique person that you are, that there's never been a person like you, and never will be another. And so that, I want to see your personality traits, I want to see your family and that sort of stuff, but you're a black man, so I need to see that. You're a gay man, I need to see that. And so I need to see the personal, the ethnic, all the other pieces of your identity. And with the Trump support, I want to, again, see people at depth. And especially in hard times or times where there's been injustice, you have to see people at multiple layers of reality all at once. And so I'm just trying to provide folks with an open way to do that. But it is true that there will people who will stonewall you. And I have this distinction in the book between illuminators and diminishers. Mm. And diminishers are people who stereotype, they're not curious about you, they don't see you, they make you feel small or unseen. Or they just insult you because they don't care. And illuminators are people who are curious about you, who make you feel lit up. And I have a quote, there's a novelist, Ian Foster, it was said of him, a biographer said of him, to be listened to by him is to be listened to with such intensity, you had to be your sharpest, most honest, best self. So we want to be illuminators. But I've been asked, like, if you're trying to be an illuminator and the other person doesn't care, they're a diminisher, what do you do? And I have found I don't know how to convert a diminisher into an illuminator. That I can't help them, I can't induce them to suddenly become curious. And a lot of people in this country are so aggrieved or in pain or alienated or angry, they're just not curious. And so I wish I had an answer for you, but I do not. If they're seeing you as an object, as a stereotype, as some image in their head of who they think a journalist is, then it's very hard to say, no, there's a person in here. I just don't have a good answer to that one.
I mean, I just got notice 10 minutes before we go to Q&A with you in the audience, so start thinking of your questions. But as I was reading your book, David, I was also thinking of something that I notice happens a lot. Sometimes there are people who ask questions and they seem really interested, but at some point it clicks. Wait a minute. I then ask a question of myself. Are they asking so many questions because they don't want me to ask them any questions? Yeah. They don't, is it out of fear? I tend to think it's, I don't want him to know anything about me.
Yeah. And so I mentioned in the book, somewhere in the book, various defenses people build up from things they learned in childhood. And one of the defenses, which happens to be my personal specialty, is avoidance. And if you've been taught that emotions are painful or if social reactions are uncomfortable, then one of the ways you can go through life is the way I would go through life. 20 years ago, if you had told me some intimacy, I would stare at my feet, and then I would have an important appointment with my dry cleaner, which I'd go off to. So I was an escape artist. But another way of people who do avoidance is they are always the helpers, but they're never asking for help themselves. They're always out to you, so you never approach them. It's their way of cutting off your connection to them. And that's a defense that grows up in childhood. And most of us carry some defenses through childhood. Another one is passive aggression. And passive aggression is fear of direct communication. So it's a manipulative form of anger, which is my wife wants to go on a weekend away with her women friends. And I say, oh, sure, honey, take a weekend. And then in the days leading up, I begin to feel sorry for myself. So I drop little hints, and then I'm mad at her all weekend because she's expressing me in this way. And so that's passive aggression. Mm-hmm. And so we carry these defenses with us, and at some level, they've worked for us. Like in our job, politics, we run into a lot of people who are fighters. They're not happy with themselves unless they're fighting. And that works at some level, but at some level it stops working. Because if all you're doing is fighting, you're like sealing off your heart, so it becomes not only unbreakable, but irredeemable. You're just closing it in. And so I think a lot of what we try to do in middle age is try to lose those defenses we built up in childhood.
Mm-hmm. In the time that we have left in our portion of our conversation, there are three stories that I would love for you to tell, and I will go through them one by one. One is the story of the young woman whose father died and what happened when she went to a friend's wedding.
Okay, so this is Jillian Sawyer, and the story is about how you show up for people. So first I mentioned the gaze, that's the first. The second stage of getting to know someone before the deep conversations is what I call accompaniment. And that is just hanging out or just doing events. You're not having deep conversations, you're just getting used to each other. And so Jillian Sawyer was a student of mine at the University of Chicago, New Haven. And she, her dad died of pancreatic cancer while she was at college. And I had her as a grad student. And so after graduation, she was invited to be a bridesmaid at a friend's wedding. And while her dad was dying, they had had the conversation that he was probably not going to get to see some of the big events in her life, like her wedding and stuff like that. And so she's at the wedding, and she watches in the reception as the dad gives a beautiful toast about his daughter. And it's affecting her. And then it comes time for the father-daughter dance. And she says, I just can't take this. So she goes off to the ladies' room just to have a cry. And when she gets out of the ladies' room, every member of her table and at the adjoining table has gotten up, and they're waiting in the hallway outside the ladies' room. And as she comes out, no one says a word. Each one of them, as she says, including some of the boyfriends of my friends who I didn't know, they just gave me a hug. And she said it was done in total silence, and it was all that I needed. And that is just a beautiful example of what presence looks like when you just show up for people and are there, and you make that's what she needed. And somebody at that table said, we need to get up for Jillian. And so somebody had presence of mind to do that. And it was a nice little encapsulation of how you do that.
I'm reducing the number of stories to just one more because we have 5 minutes until Q&A. And this story involves you. And it's the one where you're teaching a class at the University of Chicago, New Haven. And and you were holding, I think it was on Fridays, you did a office hours at a bar. But one Friday you said you weren't going to do it. Tell that story.
So was teaching, and it wasn't Fridays, it was Tuesdays, because we're busy on Fridays with each other.
Okay, sorry.
And so I was only in New Haven one night a week, and so I would have office hours between 9:30 and 1 in the morning at a bar. And 8 students would come around, and we'd just shoot the breeze for a few hours. It was just fun. It was a highlight of my week. And so I was courting a woman, this was about 10 years ago, trying to get her to marry me. And she says she's going to fly to New Haven to give me her answer, whether she'll marry me or not. And so I don't tell all this to the class. I just say to the class, I'm going to have to cancel office hours. I'm going through something personal. That's all I said. And out of the 24 students in the seminar, probably 18 of them wrote me that night, said, Mr. Professor Brooks, I just want to know I'm thinking of you, I'm praying for you, for whatever you're going through. And it changed the tenor of the whole class for the rest of the term. Because suddenly I wasn't like this austere Professor Brooks, I was just another schmo going through life. And it was even that little hint of vulnerability was a sign. A little hint of vulnerability can go a long way. And then the woman came to New Haven, and she told me she could never marry me. And now she's my wife, so it's fine.
I think that's a great happy note to end our portion of the conversation, David. Now we're going to go to Q&A from the audience, and I do believe VOG has some statements to make.
Alrighty, folks, so for the Q&A, this is how it's going to work. We have 2 mics roaming this main floor and a mic up in the balcony. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and when you get the mic, you may stand and give your name if you would like to. Please be sure to speak directly into the microphone and keep your questions brief, and please keep them to questions only.
House left.
Hi, my name is, my name is Alan Salpeter. Mr. Brooks, it's been an amazing presentation on so many levels. You've said you've talked with a lot of Trump supporters. What are the common threads that you see in those people who say they support Mr. Trump?
Yeah, there are a million different threads that run through this. It's more than one. But if I had to pick one, and there's a reason they're a Trump supporter or populists, not only in the US, but in Sweden and France and Hungary, Poland. And my number one answer for that, and this, I hear them articulate this differently than I'm about to express it, which is round about 40 or 50 years ago, the 20% most highly educated people in this country, which would include a lot of us, got to go to nice schools. The education premium is such that we tend to make more money. Then we sent our own kids off to the similar sort of nice schools, and they married each other. And then they invested a lot in their kids so they could go to nice schools. And so there's a guy named Markovitz at Yale who calculates that the average college-educated family invests in finance or in kind $10 million in each kid. And so that includes tuitions, that includes oboe practice, that includes travel sports, that includes going on vacation to Europe, that includes museums. And so those kids then marry, and they go to the same schools, they marry each other, they move to the same few cities, DC, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, Denver. And so a lot of people look at this top 20% and they see a cultural group that is separating from the rest of society. They see a cultural group that has a lot of cultural power because we're very dominant to the arts and cultural institutions. We control the media, we control the universities, increasingly corporations. And they say, those people have too much power, I hate them. And they condescend to me. And so in one form or another, and we in the media have become, for a lot of these folks, the absolute epitome of the educated class. It used to be, when I started here at the City News Bureau of Chicago, I worked alongside men and women who had never gone a day in college. It was still a bit of a working class profession. Now, if you went to the New York Times DC Bureau, and you swung an axe, you'd hit 8 people who were editor of the Harvard Crimson. It would be a good idea, by the way. No, I'm kidding. And so I think I would say that would be my number one thing I hear most often when they say you people, often, not only they have a lot of you peoples, but often it's resentment at the way the society is rigged in favor of highly educated people, especially along the coasts.
We have a question up in the balcony.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I happen to agree with all of them. I wonder what your response is to people who say that trying to initiate those kinds of deep conversations, being inquisitive, can be perceived as nosy, none of your business. That makes people uncomfortable to be asked deep personal questions and just sort of back off. How would you respond to that?
So for this book, I interviewed dozens and dozens of people who are mostly in the conversation business. And so these are people who, like Dan McAdams, who studies personal narratives, or some of these people are in sort of social repair across divides, and they sponsor events where people are asking each other deep questions. And I'd be curious to hear Jonathan's answer, but I can tell you, like, our job as journalists is to ask people questions, and sometimes to ask people questions in very uncomfortable times in their lives. And so how many times has a person ever said to me, none of your damn business? The answer is 0. And I would say, when I ask these conversation experts, how many times do people say, none of your damn business? The answer is, they'll say almost never. And that if you ask respectfully people to talk about themselves and tell their own story, they're so honored. And that, so people are dying to tell their stories, as long as you're respectful. And there's some study that was done in Belgium where they gave people the chance to tell their story or like $500. People would rather tell their story than get money. And so the human need to self-present is just very powerful, and people enjoy it when they do it. I don't know if that's been your experience.
Yeah, it has been my experience, and I've never had the experience you've had, as you wrote in the book, of going to the relatives or the neighbors of someone who's committed suicide or other horrific events. But I have been in a position where I've had to, I remember when I had to interview Trayvon Martin's mother about a month after his murder, and learning how to ask questions in a way that allows them to answer or makes them feel comfortable answering. And so in using that in those traumatic situations, I've learned how to then transfer that into having conversations with politicians, because they all want to talk. It's just a matter of how you ask the question. And so, you know, I sit there and I ponder and I think, how am I going? I'll give a story. It was the end of the Obama administration. I was basically doing exit interviews, and I was interviewing then National Security Advisor Susan Rice. I understood from other interviews with Obama officials that, you know, they will not talk about the incoming administration. And I wanted to know, basically, what are you going to tell Michael Flynn when he's the national security advisor? So instead of asking that, like, what do you make of Michael Flynn? What are you going to tell him? I asked, what's the number one issue the next national security advisor is going to face? And she said to me, what makes you think there's only one? And then gave this expansive answer that was infinitely more fascinating and illuminating than if I had asked her that specific question, which would have shut down the conversation completely.
Power of open-ended questions.
Question here to the left.
Or right. The other left.
Hello, my name is Michael. Thanks for the talk. It was great. So the title of the book is How to Know a Person, but I'm actually more curious to know where to know a person. And I think well, I guess I kind of relate that to the breakdown of the church or congregation in society, where people can be kind of unconditionally accepted. And you know, where in society, on the bus, on the train, we don't have these events all that often, but could you talk to that?
That's a very good question. Yeah, my first instinct when you first asked was, well, on 55th Street, there's a bar called Jimmy's. And my favorite noise is laughter around a bar late at night. So Jimmy's was my place when I was here, when I was of age, I want to be clear. You know, I do think I think at a park bench, I mean, walks. I do think when the conditions are right, any place will do. And one of my friends is a guy who works here at Booth at the business school. And so he's a social psychologist at Booth. And he lives further south. And so he commutes to work by what do they call it, the IC, the commuter train here. And he knows, because he's a social psychologist, that people are happiest when they're talking to each other. And so he was on the train, and he realized this whole car and this train, not a single person is talking to each other. They're all headphones and screens. And so he's a social psychologist, so next train ride up, he pays people to talk to each other. And he does a research experiment, and he pays them. And so whatever it was, $50, and then when they get downtown, he has research subjects interviewing the people. Did you enjoy this ride? And they said, I enjoyed this ride more than any other ride. And that was extroverts, that was introverts. And you would think a commuter train would not be the most hospitable place. But even with strangers, and Epley's research and his finding is that we underestimate how much people want to talk. We underestimate how much fun we'll have. And we'll underestimate how much people want to go deep fast. And when I talked to him about this research, it's changed the way I get on planes and trains and subways now. Maybe not subways, I'm still pretty aloof in subways. But I will talk to the person next to me. And it's way more memorable than anything I'm going to read on Twitter. So I talked to somebody about a year ago, who I mentioned in the book, who was like a big Trump supporter. He'd come to this country from Russia when he was 7. He started sweeping floors. He made a t-shirt company, sold t-shirts around the world. He'd gone bankrupt more times than I could count. He'd had more divorces than I could count. He showed me his vacation pictures. He's like 80 years old, and he's surrounded by beautiful 20-somethings on the back of yachts. He wasn't my cup of tea particularly, but it was fascinating.
An oligarch?
It was like
I mean...
He was an oligarch wannabe. I didn't know there was, yeah. But so I guess the point I'm trying to make is I think it's possible to be surprised when that really good conversation happens. And it can happen, and frankly, I'll just close with this. There's somebody who did this research. People are often more comfortable telling strangers about themselves than telling their friends, because there's less at stake. And so I wouldn't rule out any place for a place to have a good conversation.
All right, our next question is back here.
My name's Dan. Over the course of a career, who are a few of the more interesting people that you've had over for dinner, other than Jonathan, that you've had over for dinner?
I'll say two people. I'm going to ask Jonathan the same question after I'm done, if you can think of them. I'll say two people I've interviewed. The best interview I ever had in my life, the two best. One was with Jackie Gleason. And so they fly me down I used to be a movie critic. They fly me down to Miami. I'm in a hotel room. His wife walks in, pushes a cassette recorder, and does It's Tonight Show music. Da, 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 da. And Jackie Gleason opens the door and goes, and it's just me in a hotel room. But so he tells me for the next 90 minutes, just one hilarious story after another. The only one I can remember, it's been many years, is he was out drinking at a bar called Toots Shores in New York, and he was drinking with Joe DiMaggio. And I think it was a time when DiMaggio was still in baseball. And so, as some of you will remember, for those who are younger, Gleason was like 500 pounds. And so he tells DiMaggio, I bet I can race you around the block, and I'll beat you, and I'll bet you $1,000 I can do it. So they go outside, and they take off, and they run around the block, and then as DiMaggio is turning the final corner, he sees Gleason huffing and puffing up to the front door. He says, I can't believe you beat me. And Gleason says, well, I'm fat. I won't be able to do it twice. Let's do it double or nothing. And so the second time around, again, DiMaggio's turning the corner and sees Gleason huffing and puffing the inside up to the door. He's beating him again. And so they go inside, and DiMaggio owes him $2,000. Then 45 minutes later, he says, you know, we raced around the block. We never crossed on the bottom end. And Gleason had hired a car to drive him around the block. I'll stick with that one. Do you have one?
It was, what was the question?
One of your best interviews, or?
Oh, one of my best interviews. I would have to say, maybe not the best, but among the most memorable would be Congressman John Lewis. And I didn't interview him just once. I interviewed him several times. And when he passed away, I remember just talking about him. I had interviewed him twice within a 2-month period, which, you know, in column writing, that's verboten. You don't do that. You know, there are other people to talk to. But as I said on television, I said, you know, he wanted to talk to me. He granted me an interview. And how do you say no to an angel? He was someone, I think, who embodies a lot of the things that you write in your book, David. He was someone who was generous with his time, generous with his spirit, generous with his soul. There's so many members of Congress, current, former staffers, future members of Congress, who, if they've spent even a minute with him, come away from that encounter transformed in a way. So the fact that I was able to spend what could be, hours or days, because I went with him on his pilgrimage to Selma 4, including his very last one. And to be able to be on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with this man who made it possible for me to be in the positions that I'm in now, sitting across from you in front of all of these people, and I got to not only interview him, but know him? Come on, man.
Alrighty, folks, we have time for one last question up in the balcony. Before we do so, just a reminder that David Brooks will be doing book personalizations in the lobby following this event. And after the last question is answered, patrons, please remain seated while our speakers exit the stage, and then you can head out to the lobby for the book personalizations. All right, last question on the balcony, please.
Hi there, Mr. Brooks. My name's Rob. My question for you is, how do we create a culture? What does it take where more people would be comfortable having conversations where they're holding space? How do we get there?
Well, first, my book has 100% of the answer. I would say it's required, and then I'm coming back a little to the where question, because I think it can't only be individuals. And so the institutions are really important. And so, for example, it's whether people believe in God or not believe in God is none of my business, but if you're Jewish and somebody in your community dies, then there's this thing called sitting Shiva. And it's not obvious that if your spouse dies, the thing you should do for the next week is host a party. But sitting Shiva is a tremendously powerful way to see people and see people through some of their hardest moments. Because the very act of hosting gives the grieving something to do. And with the rule when you're sitting Shiva is you talk to the person, or you talk over the person, or you mention the name, or you don't mention the name, you follow their lead. And so the fact that when you're in a congregation and somebody dies, everybody in the congregation knows what to do. And so I worry that if we have people living with friends but without institutions, their friends may show up for them or maybe not, but there will not be an institutional response at that profound moment. So I worry about that in terms of decline in religious organizations. Then the second thing is there are some communities where having this kind of conversation is easy and some communities where it's harder. And so we work on the NewsHour, and my first 10 years on the NewsHour, the host I dealt with was, Mark and I dealt with, was Jim Lehrer. And so when I would say something good, Lehrer's eyes would crinkle with pleasure. And when I would say something crass or ignorant, I could see his mouth downturn with displeasure. And so for 10 years, I just tried to chase the eye crinkle and avoid the mouth downturn. And with those gestures, he created an atmosphere, the NewsHour way of doing things. sort of a moral ecology that we were all trained in. And Jim is gone, and Gwen is gone, and Judy is semi-retired, as much as Judy is possible to retire. But that culture is still there, and so they've created a moral ecology that we all slip into. And so in some areas, I'm going to mention somebody I was talking to earlier tonight, a couple miles west of here is Englewood. And so I had a program called Weave, where we tried to find really superstar local community builders. And we learned along the way that in any community, the neighborhood is the unit of change. You can't only, as a friend of mine says, you can't only clean the part of the swimming pool you're swimming in. You got to clean the whole pool. And so it moves neighborhood by neighborhood. And the people in the neighborhood know what to do. They don't need advice on what to do. They might need resources, but they know what to do. They know their own issues better. But so there was a woman there who I was just speaking with named Aisha Butler, who was going to move out because it's a bit dangerous. And as she was moving out, she'd said goodbye to her friends. She'd had a barbecue. And she looks across out of her window and sees a little girl playing in a pink dress in an empty lot with broken bottles. And she turns to her husband and says, "We're not going to be another family who left." And he's like, "Really?" And she says, "Yeah, we're not leaving." And so she doesn't know what to do. She just knows she's going to stay in Englewood. And communities are saved by those who are stickers, who will stick. And so she Googles volunteer in Englewood. And then she joins this organization. She volunteers here, volunteers there. And now she runs RAGE, which is the big community organization in Englewood. And when we visited her, it's been a couple of years now, there were T-shirts that the kids could wear, "Proud daughter of Englewood, proud son of Englewood." And when you have community leaders like that who are called weavers, creating that kind of environment, suddenly the level of distrust is a little lower, and suddenly it's possible to have that kind of connection. So the point I'm trying to make is the problem is not only solved on the individual level by reading a book. It's got to be solved on the community level by people who are really building trust to make these kind of vulnerable conversations possible.
I mean, I know it says wrap soon, but I'm going to wrap now. And the book that David, yeah, you can write one book, but this is one hell of a book. How to Know a Person, the Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen and Heard. David Brooks, thank you very much.